Hi there, Scott here, founder and chief strategist at Innate Strategies and the source for emergent impact. I wanted to share this particular story with you for a couple of reasons. One is a society-wide project, which means it had to be able to account for and integrate and resolve a variety of different perspectives in a fairly conflicted space, that of Guatemala at the time. And the second reason is it was one of the two origin projects that out of which emergent impact arose. There was both of these came up simultaneously. I think REAMP was slightly ahead of Guatemala, so I had a chance to practice these in the REAMP setting before coming into Guatemala with it. They were situations where the challenge was such that they were systems already in conflict. And so how you design a process that helps to mitigate that conflict in a way that moves the actors in the system toward what I believe are our natural desires to collaborate and to be in relationship with one another, so long as it's in the context of something that is mutually beneficial. So that's the reason for jumping into this project. Let's see. I do want to say that it's not just about this project. Over the last 20 years since this way of working arose, it's been it's been successful in a host of different issues, cultures, industries. And it's been highly successful in solving what my clients have called impossible problems that seem to be impossible because of their complexity and the number of stakeholders until they're not. So with that as a little bit of a preface, let's move into the project itself. When Jim Ritchie Dunham and I first became acquainted with CARE International, and then CARE Guatemala more specifically, they had a presenting problem. They had been in Guatemala for 40 years. Their goal had been to stop poverty and social injustice, and things have been getting worse and worse. And that's a clear sign that there's something systemic going on, that you're applying these sort of symptomatic reliefs to it on sort of the edges of the problem, but the core, the root dynamic of the problem isn't well understood. So what we realized needed to happen was we had to get to the real problem, which was understanding the fundamental dynamics of poverty. And we actually had an assumption that CARE International understood that, given all of their history in the space. And it turns out that they had never thought about it that way. They had thought about doing different kinds of projects to help people in their specific day-to-day situations, but they hadn't really stepped back and focused on, well, what's the global dynamic that's causing this problem? So that became our true charge. So a few key facts about the project itself. We always go for a 360-degree engagement in any project. And examples of that 360 in that case, there was on one side leaders in the military, and on the other side former guerrilla leaders. Then there were Mayan shamans and Catholic priests. There was the economics minister and the university students. There were these different opposing forces in Guatemalan society that would have to be accounted for and included if we were to bring this toward anything like some sort of directional resolution. And the other important thing I think about this, is the key fact, is that this only required 7 days of flying time, which is pretty remarkable. That's largely because most of the work happens sort of behind the scenes, and so that we can bring that to them sort of in a rough draft form for them to then revise and validate and make sure that what's been produced is accurate. There is a story about this in the Systems Thinker magazine that you can find if you look online. Now, the general flow of projects like this, the emergent impact flow, is to begin with the individual level, to make sure that we do individual maps, and then move from there ideally to subgroup meetings, and then to an integrative map, and then do a collective analysis on that map where the clients themselves participate in the analysis. And out of that then comes a strategy map, which is the leverage points, which is sort of the promise of systems thinking, is where's the highest leverage opportunities in the system. But rather than just a list of those, they're linked together as their own little microcosm, their own little microsystem. Now, the way that we did the work in Guatemala has evolved considerably from that list I just showed you. In this case, though, we did a significant number of interviews initially to get our heads around the system and to begin to get thoughts about it. We did a subgroup meeting first. And the cornerstone of a subgroup meeting is what's called a behavior over time graph. And this is the Spanish equivalent of those words, behavior over time graph. So let me describe this to you. There's a goal that you come up with first. That's the first thing you do. And in this case, we task pods within the group of people that we brought together and asked them to define what they believed should be the goal. And I use the word goal roughly. It's more like a stepping stone on a path towards a vision that we can't even quite yet see. But when we did that, the observers from CARE International said, oh, no, they can't modify, the purpose for our being here in Guatemala. That's poverty and social injustice. That's set at the international level. Can't mess with that. And my response to them was, well, just give it a minute. Let's see what happens. You can always go back to that goal. So it turned out that in the goal setting process, no one could actually define poverty. And I mean, they could have defined it in a numerical way or something like that. But if you're talking about the human experience, it turns out that people that were living in their traditional ways, about 70% of the population was indigenous Quiché and Hmong peoples, in that sort of Mayan, traditional Mayan lifestyle, that were growing corn and potatoes on a hillside with their in their village, were incredibly happy. Yeah, they had the kinds of human connections they needed, the connection to the earth, the connection to their ancestors that left them in a place of contentment and even bliss. However, people living in a high rise in Guatemala City, making all the money you would think one would need to live a good life in Guatemala City, were desperately unhappy. So they realized they couldn't define poverty by the traditional kind of economic metrics. So what they realized was that what they really were seeking was the capacity to develop my own potential. So my own, self-determination. And this eventually, the shorthand became economic self-determination, given that poverty was a critical thing. And that handled the social injustice element at the same time. Now, what was really important about this, probably well, for one thing, it's a positive goal, not a negative goal. And negative goals don't work. And I have a whole other video on that if you care to see that. But it was a positive goal, and it was a radically different goal from stopping poverty and social injustice. That conversation had been going on in Guatemala for 40 years, and it hadn't gotten much traction. And there weren't that many people interested in talking about it, especially at the national level. So once that became the goal, as we then began to approach people for interviews to get that 360, and we told them that we were trying to explore economic self-determination, all of a sudden the military was interested because they were graduating officers into society who needed to be able to make a living when they got out of the military. The universities were interested because they were trying to train, students to be able to participate in the economy. The economics minister was interested because obviously, he wanted economic self-determination as well. Suddenly, a whole set of doors opened up that weren't available to us before. So that was the beauty of doing that. Now, to explain this to you briefly, this was the goal, and here's the goal not performing at 0, and here's the goal performing at 10. And once the goal is set, you name the high and low points of the goal, and then you mark out time. In this case, they wanted to go back about 20 years, one generation, and go out one generation. And so here's today. And then we asked the question, where was it 20 years ago? And here you see it was quite low at about a 3. And then we had the revolution going on, the civil war going on, that began to change and create a return to democracy. And that led finally to the peace accords in 1996. And that then began to level off as many of the peace accords began to get implemented. And then the FRG won power again after a few years, and they began to re-implement the kinds of policies and practices that was beginning to return them to the pre-peace accord state. And that kind of flattened out for a bit here. But the concern was, what was going to happen going forward? And going forward, they believed it was going to continue to deteriorate because the power of the FRG was getting stronger and stronger. And then that deterioration would level off a little bit, but it would still continue to level off, to try to decline. Then we asked the question, and this is a very misunderstood question. It's a critically important question, though. It is, okay, what if this goal is to have any chance of survival and thriving, what must happen by when? Now, this is very different than how. People get confused. If you say what must happen by when, you're simply talking about the math of it. And that's a really straightforward question. The how gets in people's way. They'll say, well, we don't think that's realistic, or we don't see it like it possibly happen. That's a second order question. The first order question is, what must happen by when in order for this goal to have any chance of surviving so that it might be able to thrive? And they said, well, it has to get significantly better in a fairly short order of time, about 10 years. And then it can begin to taper off, but still continue to increase over time. And that creates this gap. Now, this gap, when we talk about you have to have a positive, and then we say reality-based, measurable time-specific goal. This is the reality-based. This is what reality is saying needs to happen. It's not about the realistic. Is it realistic to do it? It's about what is reality saying must happen. and the notion of what's realistic gets misinterpreted so many times. So this gap here, by the way, is a source of tremendous energy. These people have come together, and in the beginning, remember, they had no shared understanding about the word poverty. They were all over the place about it, but they landed on this notion of self-determination. And that was a very powerful realization on their part, and something they were both proud of and excited about. Then they were able to track what's been happening to this over a whole lot more data points than the ones you see here. We have this, by the way, is the source for a fact versus an opinion-based conversation. And by fact, what I mean is people, when they say, it starts to go up here, we say, well, what has you say that? What's the data that you present? What has the data that has it level off or drop, or anytime it diverts in some way at any inflection point, then what has you say that? Where we get in trouble is these opinion-based conversations. Well, I think that, or I believe that, or I feel like. That gets us in all kinds of trouble. So this fact-based conversation, people are trading all this data back and forth with each other, about 20 people in this room, and suddenly becoming more and more informed about the state of reality. They're becoming more and more informed about what their colleagues in the room know. They're changing their opinions about their colleagues. I used to think you didn't know very much. Now I realize you know quite a bit, and that quite a bit is useful to me. And they're doing so in the context of something they care about. So by the time this gap emerges, they're in a very high state of energy, and then we tap that energy. We capture those words so that we can have them in the future when the going gets a little tougher. We can flash both this graph back up, and we can flash those words back up and say, but you said we had to be this way in order to close that gap. So that's enough on a behavior over time graph. And by the way, I have a more extensive video about how you do one of these. If you care for that, just email me. I'm happy to send it to you. All right, so that's the behavior over time graph. Now, with that, we then began to approach people that we couldn't get to before about, may we interview you? So here's someone we had a real hard time getting to, was Fito, who was he was a former economics minister. He had run for president in the past. He was currently the minister for local economic development because that was seen as a severe need inside the society. And we had a heck of a time getting a hold of him. But finally we did. And we ended up, I think, interviewing him at like 9 o'clock at night at some office building out on the outskirts of Guatemala City. And following that 1 hour interview, which is typically just an hour-long interview, Jim produced this causal diagram. Now, we do causal diagrams now in a much different way, sort of more structured, a little more, I guess I would say, a little more valuable to the clients, the way that we see, like, what are the specific steps they need to take and how might they leverage it. But the overall point, both with this map and the one that we produced today, is that it's critical that we add significant value to whoever we're interviewing, because a couple of reasons. One, we want them to participate going forward. And if we're not adding significant value to them, why are they going to continue to play with us? The other is we really need to understand their point of view in a very relatively rigorous way so that we can use that point of view when we have a 360-degree set of those 48 perspectives. We can use that to construct an image of the ecosystem as a whole, be it a business, a social, or a natural ecosystem, whatever one we're kind of talking about. This was so valuable to Fito, helped explain so much of what he was about and the kinds of things he had to be concerned about across Guatemalan society, that he was, number one, delighted with it, and number two, he agreed to participate in the next steps in this process, which happens consistently. So I'm zooming in on this new conversation bit was because that change in the goal was what prompted a new kind of a conversation for Fito and for Freddie, who was head of the strategy group, for the leader of the military strategy group, and everybody else that we interviewed. It was just a very different kind of conversation they got to have towards something they wanted as opposed to away from something they didn't. All right, so you'll see at the top here, I've got this note. It's not about the map and not as in quotes. So what I mean by that is people often get fixated on the map as, oh, it's just the most important thing there can be. Now, it's significantly important. It's a very necessary artifact. It lies at the root of the analysis and several other things. But the most important thing about the map is it's about the conversation. The map literally holds the conversation, and it does it in a way that titrates. By that, I mean it breaks the larger charge of the issue of economic self-determination into little bitty pieces, each of which can be talked about separately when the charge is much reduced, and you can move through it bit by bit by bit by bit. And as you clarify and rework the map and build it out to meet the understanding of the group as a whole, then you end up with not only a very solid map, but a very solid group of people who are clearly committed to shifting this ecosystem based on what they've come to understand at a level of fairly significant depth. I'll give you an example of what some of the depth looks like. Here's this capacity to self-sustain. And to give you a sense of the rigor and the level of detail you can get to in one of these, even though it's, in some ways it's not that big. It's this, 11 by 17 piece of paper. So this capacity to self-sustain has all these things that help determine it. Now, the blue arrows are a same-to-same relationship, like as health increases, then the capacity to self-sustain increases. But some are inverse relationships. So, for example, the cost of basic necessities, standard cost of basic necessities, as that rises, the ability to self-sustain goes down. The other one over here is the social standard of basic necessities. As that rises, the capacity to self-sustain goes down. Now, by that we mean you need a new car, or you need a new television, or you need a new house, or whatever the social standard has become because of the nature of being human. And that's driven by mass media, advertising, things like that. So it covers those kinds of things. It covers basic services like education and water and light. It also covers things like the ability to, the capacity to be, just to be. And that's a function of my ability to develop into a complete human, whether I'm, a man or a woman. And that's driven by in the degree of colonial mentality, authoritarianism and patriarchy and those kinds of things. So the map gets into a fairly high level of discrimination. And the questions we ask, and that's why you saw that 3 questions at the bottom of that, we ask 3 questions. We announce them at the beginning so people will know what to look for as they go through the map. And then we ask them at the end. And the 3 questions are, is this your whole world, all of its bits and pieces, and the relationship of those bits and pieces? And so that's the first thing, because we need to make sure we've got an accurate map. And the second piece is, does this describe for you why you're experiencing what you're experiencing today and how you could experience what you're seeking to experience in the future? And in that sense, it's like the human body. This body can lie on a couch, eat chips, and watch TV, or it can compete in a marathon. It's the same system. It's a matter of how the resources in the system are weighted, how they're strengthened or weakened. And this map should do the same thing. If health is high, if the ability to be is high, if cost of living is low, then you can see how that would work. But if all of those are inverted, you can see how that would work. The third question we ask is, do you see yourself in here, or the issue you care about? Because if you don't, well, number 1, the map is incomplete. And number 2, why would you want to play? So it's really important that people see themselves in here. All right. Now, once that map has been completed and the group has gone through it, and we did bring the whole group into this, we did do other subgroup meetings, by the way. But once we had the map completed, then we did a collective analysis of that. Involving the client in the analysis and then doing some systemic analysis as well. And here's what emerged. And it was actually quite fascinating. And it helped me understand something about what was going wrong, from my perspective, at least in the US at the time. But let me get to the Guatemalan side first and then come back to the US. So the most important variable on this whole map is Guatemalan multicultural identity. And when we say multicultural identity, it was primarily a Mayan identity because about 70% of the population, as I said before, was Quiché and that of a Mayan heritage. Now, for decades, the federal government, which is not so indigenously represented, was trying to define what Guatemalan multicultural identity would be, which was a fool's errand because they weren't of that legacy. They were more of the Spanish, the conquistador legacy. But once that Guatemalan multicultural identity is clear, and it's clearly more Mayan than it is Western, then that will determine the kinds of social structures and processes that are put in place that will help to then strengthen the social fabric of Guatemala, which will then reinforce the Guatemalan multicultural identity. The Mayan identity was largely excluded from the Guatemalan identity, even though it represents 70% of the population. Now, as that strengthens, well, then the processes and structures strengthen and the cycle continues. So it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. So there's a very strong reinforcing loop here. The other thing that happens with these structures and processes getting stronger is the kinds of economic opportunities that begin to emerge get stronger. And for example, at the time, one of the big economic opportunities, so to speak, was assembling Jordache jeans. Well, that's not part of the Mayan destiny. And so if we have more of these kinds of economic opportunities informed by the Guatemalan identity, then the kinds of capacity to self-sustain are more aligned with that identity. And as self-sustaining increases, then the ability to self-determine, which took the form of Guatemalan entrepreneurs, gets stronger and stronger. As that happens, those entrepreneurs create more economic opportunities, and the cycle continues. So this too strengthens as a reinforcing loop. Then the other sort of offshoot of the stronger social fabric is that as the social fabric gets stronger, so does the capacity to self-determine. That gets stronger as well. So this whole thing becomes a set of reinforcing loops, which allow this positive upward spiral of Guatemalan society. Now, this 5% here, I put this here to call out the fact that out of that more complex map you saw a moment ago, this represents only 5% of the variables, which is in keeping with the promise of systems thinking, which is that, once you understand the system, you should be able to identify where to intervene, much like an acupuncture point, if you were in acupuncture, or much like a physician should be able to pinpoint the particular medicine or method you might need in order to help you recover from an illness or an injury. That's the whole point of having that kind of expert view of the whole. All right, so that was that. Now, here's what surprised me. Well, lots of things surprised me, but this one especially surprised me. Having done that project in Guatemala, and then having done a project that mirrored the Guatemalan project in many ways, actually it preceded some of the Guatemalan elements in some ways in the Midwest, called REAMP, about climate change, with 8 Midwestern states. The folks at CARE International asked me to teach a class about how that Guatemala project worked. And so in order to convey to them what was happening, I had to sit and think about it, that we were building from the level of the self, and then with one another, and then at a team level, which is the subgroups, and so forth. You can read these things yourself. It's a very organic unfolding of progression. And what we were doing was first building relationship in the interview process. And relationship was key, because without trusting relationship, then we couldn't get to clarity. And the relationship side was an expression of what I'd learned as a trauma psychotherapist and developmental psychotherapist, all of which can be taught. The key pieces that are needed for this kind of work can be taught. And then the clarity side represented the systems thinking, the system dynamics, the kind of system tools like a behavioral time graph, or the small causal diagrams, or the integrated map, those kinds of things, or the analyses. That's the clarity side of the equation. Now, I put these 3 columns together to help explain it to the folks in Atlanta. And I suddenly realized, well, yeah, but what's the point of it? Why would you do that? And then it suddenly dawned on me, and this was the surprising part, that if I'm not in relationship with myself at this layer, and if I'm not clear, do not follow me. It's not a good bet. But if I am in a relationship with myself, and I am clear at the level of self, that's the first time I can actually offer decent leadership. And at the level of one another, relationship and clarity yields trust. With the team, it's when we innovate, we pull together teams to usually fix a problem or innovate something. At the level of the organization, it's execution. We create organizations to do things that individuals and teams alone can't do. At the level of the market or a constituency, it's about scalability, figuring that out. And then at the level of an ecosystem, again, be it business, social, or natural ecosystem, earth-based, is sustainability. So that frame is what then, and these kind of, what are the principles that we're going for here? By the way, there's a similar slide that I'm not going to bring up about the specific practices that go in each of those boxes. That became the basis for the work for the last 20 years. All right, so that basic frame is what enabled success in these different projects and with these kinds of numbers. And by the way, I've not updated these numbers in quite a few years, so they're quite a bit behind. They may, well, except for the SDGs, because there are only 17 of them, they may have doubled over that time period. Now, because of the success of this, I've made a promise. Now, I wanted to call this out here because there's something I find very, very useful, and almost every leader I speak with, I'd say, I can't think of a leader for whom this has not landed really strongly. There's a guy named Jipa Zhou, who is the CEO of a Swedish pharmaceutical company called Pharmacia. And he made a statement, something along the lines of leadership is the act of making a promise that must be made, and then having to change in order to keep it. And when I came across it, I realized that's what happened to me as a rolfer and a trauma therapist. When someone who's psychotic comes into your practice, you really don't quite know what's going to happen and what you're going to do. It's a mystery, but you know that you must help them. And so I found that to be very true about what's confronting us today in the world. And as a result, I've made a promise to train 15,000 practitioners at all 4 levels of skill here, which is the individual, the team, the organization, and ecosystem, to create a global community of people capable of solving what my clients have called impossible problems. And I've even gotten impact investor funding for this. If you want to know more, please have a look at emergingimpact.com. Reach out to me, and I'll be happy to share what I've learned. Take good care. Bye-bye.